All of the empirical evidence shows that voter fraud happens, but rarely. It's generally, we don't see it often at all. When, on the rare occasions we do see it, it tends to be one-off individual ballots or an attempt to steal a municipal race or a small county race, because those are the races that you can actually manipulate with fewer ballots. It's exceedingly rare, and in fact, virtually unknown in the modern era, to see fraud impact a statewide race or something as large as a presidential race. And that seems to be the pattern at this point as well. The 2020 elections, we have heard from Republican election officials, from Democratic election officials, from election officials who belong to neither party, was generally speaking clean. Things went about as expected. That's not to say there weren't glitches along the way. That's not to say there weren't administrative errors. That's not to say that a voter or two, a handful of voters, may have engaged in misconduct. But nobody has been able to identify in any state any fraud of any sort of or any sort of misconduct widespread enough to indicate that the results we have now are wrong or that they were unlawfully obtained.
We just heard there's a hand recount going to happen in Georgia.
A hand recount in a state as close as Georgia, I think, is fine, is reasonable. Georgia is, as you well know, extremely divided, and the results were extremely close. I don't think that the recount is likely to change the results. Recounts generally swing a few hundred votes in a statewide election, and the margin's now greater than that. So I think it's exceedingly unlikely that the recount will reveal misconduct or wrongdoing or even errors in the tabulation process that swing more than a few hundred votes. I would expect a few hundred votes to swing back and forth. A recount is our way of making a list and checking it twice. So we'll find a few things when we check it twice. I don't have an objection to pursuing a recount. That's certainly available to candidates when races are this close, but I also don't expect that it'll change the result.
What would you say to people who say they don't believe you and they think there's widespread voter fraud?
I understand why they might feel that way. They've been hearing it for a long time, including from the president, including before the election, when he was merely predicting without substantiation, without evidence, his gut feel, rather than actually reacting to anything that happened. They've also been hearing it from lots of third-party media. They've been hearing it sort of in the internet. They've been hearing it in social media. And so I understand that there may be this feeling that something funny has happened. But I'd also suggest we know from past elections that the people most likely to have that feeling are people whose preferred candidate has lost the race. That is, if you actually poll people after a race, independent of party, independent of outcome, people whose preferred candidate lost are far more suspicious that the election had to be stolen or that there was some misconduct than people whose candidate won. And that is a little odd if the thing that's doing the work there is actual misconduct rather than difficulty processing the fact that there may have been more people favoring the opponent than favored the candidate you preferred. I'd also say it's really important to ground yourself, everybody, in real facts. And so rather than just indulging the notion that there must have been fraud out there somewhere in the world, I'd encourage people to try and pin down what happened where, how many ineligible voters were alleged to have done something improper, and really follow that through. A lot of the more inflated claims, a lot of the wilder suspicions, if you poke at it a little bit, it turns out there's not much there. And real people can figure that out if they have the incentive, if they have the motivation to try and figure out whether what they're hearing is noise or what they're hearing is actual real concern.
When you talk about people who are more inclined to think fraud exists when their candidate loses, are they more inclined not to think fraud exists when their candidate concedes?
I don't know that a concession, unless it's very quick, is all that powerful. So people get really invested in political campaigns. I understand that. There's a lot of not only rationality about who you prefer, there's a lot of emotion bound up in a political campaign, intentionally. Candidates across the aisle, Democrats and Republicans and third-party candidates try to create that emotion, that bond with their voters. And so it's understandable that that may take some processing. Even when a candidate concedes, I think there are still rumblings of discontent about the election process. That's one way of displacing the notion that there might be more people out there who just disagree with you. I have that in my own social circle. In addition to politics, we all know it's tough to think that you might be wrong or that other people might have a different view. I will say that concessions help people come to terms faster with the notion that an election was legitimate. That's part of why they're offered. That's part of why politicians offer those concessions, because they have faith in the underlying structure of democracy. And contrary to that, it's really dangerous for democracy if there's no possibility that we might be in the minority, all of us. So if we go into an election and the only possibilities are we won or it was stolen, that's not a democratic system. We have to, every single one of us have to acknowledge at least the possibility that we might go into an election and come out the other side finding out that more people, more legitimate voters preferred the opposing candidate. That's hard to do, but it's really essential for a system that depends on the will of the voters.
Down ballots that win kind of are not indicative of fraud, correct?
It would be unusual for a political party to try to steal only one race and leave all other races as they were. That is, if you really believe the Democratic Party was out to steal this election, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to steal the presidential race and not Senate races or congressional races or state legislative races. The simpler explanation, Occam's razor, if you're looking for the thing you don't have to work to explain, it's that voters voted their conscience, that they actually chose the candidates on the ballot they preferred. In Georgia, in a lot of down ballot races, those were Republicans. For the president, it happened to be Joe Biden, not by a lot. It's a very narrow race, but it certainly looks like voters chose Joe Biden. And that's a much more straightforward explanation than some sort of conspiracy that relies on only changing votes at the top of the ticket and leaving everything else as it was. It's tough to understand why, if you had the capacity to pull off a statewide heist, and I want to emphasize, nobody's got the capacity to pull off a statewide heist. It is immensely difficult, given the safeguards in the system, to perpetrate fraud on anything approaching a state or federal level and not have it immediately caught and exposed. But if you managed that Ocean's 11 times 1,000 heist of the system, it's a little hard to understand why you would have left Senate candidates with a runoff, why you would have left Republican candidates down ballot, having won their races cleanly and flat out. It's hard to understand the logic behind that decision. So there was a presidential commission ostensibly on voter integrity. I'll say I was not a particular fan of the way that the commission was staffed from the get-go. It did not look like it was a serious body meant to examine whether there were real problems in the American electorate. We've had those before. We've had bipartisan versions of those before. The one that was created in, I believe, late 2017, maybe 2018, was not particularly designed to provide real meaningful results and didn't provide real meaningful results. There was a lot of resistance to the way they went about doing their business. They didn't seem to care about the privacy of the voters, whose records they were ultimately looking into. An awful lot of conservative secretaries of state said, you know what, we don't need you messing around in our elections, no thank you. I believe the Secretary of State in Mississippi told the commission to go jump in a lake. So there was a lot of resistance, I think correctly, and as a result, the commission didn't actually find much. That's probably because there wasn't that much to find. And I want to be really clear, individuals sometimes commit misconduct. There's a reason that we have law enforcement, because not every person is an angel. And so there are occasionally individual instances of fraudulent ballots that are cast by a handful of people. There are also occasionally attempts to rig or steal or buy a smaller municipal election, usually the old-fashioned way, stuffing the ballot box. Mm-hmm. But to pull off something like that on a statewide or national scale is exceedingly difficult. And that's the cleanest explanation for why we don't see it here. Georgians should actually be comparatively proud of the system they have. There's a lot that I would say that needs adjusting and reform come January when the legislative session starts again. There are an awful lot of ways in which it could serve voters even better, particularly voters across the board. I am not saying that Georgia's system couldn't deal with a little bit of tinkering in order to make it fairer for everybody. But I am saying there is no evidence whatsoever that fraud or misconduct marred the latest Georgia elections. And Georgians can actually listen to their own election officials to hear the straight scoop. You don't have to believe me. Listen to the people on the ground who were running the elections, and you'll hear them say, this one was not marred by misconduct. This one was not marred by fraud. We had an election where the voters actually spoke.